In 1914, Britain wasn't just one of the world's great powers. It was the financial center of the world. Its currency fueled global trade. Its banks financed governments across continents. Its ships connected an empire so vast that people famously said the sun never set on it. From London, money flowed to every corner of the globe. And wherever that money went, British influence followed. 3 years later, that same empire was running out of cash. Its gold reserves were disappearing. Its debts were exploding. Its government was desperately searching for anyone willing to keep the money flowing. Here's the question most history books never ask. What does the world's most powerful empire do when it can no longer afford to remain powerful? Most people think the answer lies on the battlefields of the First World War. It doesn't. The answer was written inside a letter only 67 words long. A letter that promised land Britain didn't yet control, to people who largely didn't live there, while quietly ignoring the people who already did. For generations, the Balfour Declaration has been explained as an act of diplomacy, or humanitarian concern, or wartime politics. But those explanations leave out one uncomfortable question. What if this wasn't primarily about ideology? What if it was about survival? Because before Britain made one of the most consequential promises in modern history, it first had to confront a terrifying reality. The richest empire on earth was running out of money. To understand why the Balfour Declaration happened, you have to forget everything you know about Britain today. Go back to 1914. At that moment, Britain wasn't simply another European country. It occupied a position no nation had ever held on quite the same scale. London wasn't merely a capital city. It was the beating heart of the global financial system. International merchants settled accounts in pounds sterling. Governments borrowed through London's banks. Insurance companies underwrote trade crossing every major ocean. Gold flowed through the vaults of the City of London in staggering quantities. If global commerce had a central nervous system, it was there. Britain's empire stretched across every inhabited continent, from Hong Kong to Cairo, from Calcutta to Buenos Aires. Its navy protected shipping lanes. Its banks financed investment. Its legal institutions gave investors confidence. Even countries outside the British Empire depended heavily on British capital. In many ways, Britain's greatest export wasn't manufactured goods. It was credit. That mattered because credit creates influence. A country that lends money doesn't simply earn interest. It gains leverage. Governments that borrow become tied to their creditors. Businesses expand using borrowed capital. Entire economies begin revolving around the financial system providing those loans. By the early 20th century, Britain had become the world's banker. Its overseas investments alone represented an astonishing share of national wealth. Its economy appeared disciplined. Its budgets appeared stable. Its debt remained relatively modest. To observers across Europe and America, Britain's financial supremacy looked permanent, almost inevitable. Few imagined anything capable of threatening it. Then came August 1914. The assassination of an Austrian archduke triggered a chain reaction that plunged Europe into war. Like many governments, British leaders believed the conflict would end quickly, perhaps within months, perhaps by Christmas. Instead, the war became something the modern world had never witnessed. A conflict fought not by small professional armies, but by entire industrial economy. Every month consumed unimaginable quantities of steel, coal, food, ships, explosive, artillery, ammunition. Every day required more factories, more workers, more raw materials, and above all, more money. The empire that had spent generations lending to others suddenly found itself borrowing to survive. And once that process began, it accelerated faster than almost anyone believed possible. Britain had entered the war as the world's greatest creditor. Within only a few years, it would be desperately searching for lenders of its own, and one American bank would soon hold the fate of the British Empire in its hands. When Britain entered the First World War in August of 1914, confidence was everywhere. The government believed it had the strongest navy on earth, the world's largest financial center, an industrial base capable of sustaining a long campaign. Most importantly, it believed it had the resources to outlast Germany. There was just one problem. Almost everyone believed the war would be short. Politicians expected a quick victory. Military planners imagined decisive battle. Even ordinary citizens assumed their soldiers would be home by Christmas. None of that happened. Instead, Europe descended into a kind of warfare nobody had ever experienced before. The age of industrial war had arrived. Every offensive consumed mountains of ammunition. Every mile gained required thousands of artillery shells. Machine guns devoured bullets at astonishing speed. Railroads carried endless streams of coal, steel, horses, food, and replacement troops to the front. This wasn't simply a war between armies. It was a war between entire economies. And economies run on money. Very quickly, Britain's traditional methods of financing war began to fail. Higher taxes helped. War bonds attracted patriotic investors. But neither came close to covering the staggering cost of keeping millions of soldiers supplied. Every passing month forced the Treasury to borrow even more. By 1915, the government's original financial assumptions had already collapsed. By 1916, borrowing had reached levels that only a few years earlier would have been considered reckless. Then came 1917. The numbers became almost unimaginable. Britain's national debt had exploded from roughly £650 million before the war to nearly £7.2 billion. Defense spending consumed more than half of the country's total economic output. Every year, the government spent well over a quarter of Britain's entire GDP on the war effort. No financial system could absorb that kind of pressure forever. Yet Britain's own military wasn't the only one demanding money. That was the detail making the crisis far more dangerous than most people realized. Britain had quietly become the financial backbone of the entire Allied coalition. France depended on British credit. Italy depended on British credit. Belgium, Serbia, Romania. Even as Russia's economy spiraled toward collapse, Britain continued trying to support its ally. The empire wasn't just financing its own survival. It was financing almost everyone else's as well. Every loan increased the burden. Every shipment of weapons required another payment. Every new offensive meant another round of borrowing. Soon, taxation covered only a fraction of total wartime spending. The rest came from debt. Debt issued at a pace never before attempted in British history. The world's greatest creditor was becoming one of the world's largest borrowers. And as Britain's need for money grew more desperate, its choices became fewer, because there was only one country left with enough financial strength to keep the Allied war effort alive: the United States. More specifically, one institution sitting at the very center of American finance, J.P. Morgan Company. And what happened next transformed the First World War from a military conflict into one of the greatest financial dramas ever played out. Britain believed J.P. Morgan was saving the empire. In reality, the bank had placed a massive bet on Britain's survival, and if Britain fell, Morgan itself could fall with it. By late 1915, Britain's financial crisis had reached a dangerous turning point. The empire still possessed enormous wealth on paper. It still controlled vast territory. It still commanded the world's most powerful navy. But wars aren't fought with paper wealth. They are fought with cash. Every artillery shell purchased in America had to be paid for. Every shipment of grain crossing the Atlantic required financing. Every locomotive, every rifle, every ton of steel demanded immediate payment. Britain's gold reserves were disappearing far too quickly to keep up. Shipping bullion across the Atlantic had become increasingly risky as German submarines hunted merchant vessels with growing success. Even if Britain still possessed gold, moving it safely had become a gamble. So the government turned to something far less tangible: credit. And no institution provided more of it than J.P. Morgan and Company. From the very beginning of the war, Morgan had become Britain's principal financial representative in the United States. The relationship was enormously profitable. Morgan arranged the purchase of billions of dollars worth of American goods for Britain and its allies. Factories expanded production. Farmers sold record harvests. Steel companies ran around the clock. Wall Street earned commissions. American industry boomed despite the country's official neutrality. Then came one of the largest financial operations in modern history. In October 1915, Morgan organized a $500 million Anglo-French loan, at that time the largest foreign bond issue Wall Street had ever seen. The investors participating weren't anonymous speculators. They were some of the most influential names in American business: industrialists, steel magnates, bankers, mining fortunes, men whose wealth increasingly depended on an Allied victory. With every new loan, Britain's survival became more closely tied to Morgan. But something else was happening at exactly the same time. Morgan wasn't simply lending money. It was accumulating risk, enormous risk. As Britain's need for financing grew, so did its unpaid obligation. By early 1917, J.P. Morgan was carrying roughly $500 million in short-term British debt, much of it unsecured. That meant Morgan had effectively wagered a substantial portion of its own financial future on one assumption. Britain had to win. Not eventually. Not someday. It had to survive long enough to repay its creditors. If Britain defaulted, those loans could become nearly worthless. The consequences would extend far beyond one investment bank. By now, countless American businesses had become financially connected to Allied purchasing contracts. Factories had expanded, banks had extended credit, investors had purchased bonds. Wall Street itself had become deeply intertwined with Britain's war effort. Historian Niall Ferguson later made a striking observation. When the United States eventually entered the war, it wasn't only Britain that received a rescue. In many ways, J.P. Morgan was rescued as well. Without continued British solvency, the interests of Britain and Morgan had become almost impossible to separate. For Britain, Morgan represented access to desperately needed capital. For Morgan, Britain's survival protected billions of dollars already at risk. Both sides needed each other, but there was still one person with even greater power than either of them. A man who didn't control a private bank. He controlled the American government, President Woodrow Wilson. And unlike Morgan, Wilson wasn't interested in keeping the existing financial system exactly as it was. He saw Britain's dependence as leverage, an opportunity to reshape the balance of global power itself. With a single decision, President Woodrow Wilson would prove that controlling money could be just as powerful as commanding armies, and Britain was about to discover that the world's greatest empire was no longer in control of its own financial destiny. By the end of 1916, Britain's financial survival depended on one country more than any other, the United States, but depending on American money didn't mean Britain controlled it. Quite the opposite. The closer Britain moved toward financial exhaustion, the more influence Washington gained over every major decision London hoped to make. And President Woodrow Wilson understood that perfectly. Wilson officially kept the United States neutral during the early years of the war. Publicly, he spoke the language of peace. Privately, however, he watched the financial balance of the world changing in real time. He realized something few leaders had fully grasped. The nation controlling credit could shape the outcome of the war long before soldiers reached the battlefield. Then he made his move. In late November 1916, Wilson instructed the Federal Reserve to discourage American banks and investors from extending new foreign loans and purchasing additional foreign securities. On the surface, it appeared to be a cautious financial decision. In reality, it landed like a warning shot aimed directly at Britain. Only days later, J.P. Morgan planned to launch an enormous $1.5 billion Anglo-French bond issue to finance the Allied offensives scheduled for 1917. Wilson's intervention threw those plans into uncertainty. Suddenly, the financial pipeline Britain depended upon could no longer be taken for granted. The pressure became immediate. Britain's overdraft with Morgan continued climbing. By the spring of 1917, it approached $400 million. France stood on the edge of financial exhaustion. Russia was sliding toward revolution. The Allied coalition wasn't simply fighting Germany anymore. It was fighting bankruptcy. For London, the situation became terrifying. If American private credit disappeared, how long could the empire continue paying for the war? Not just its own war, everyone else's as well. The answer was becoming painfully clear. Not very long. Historical records suggest that by the summer of 1917, Britain had come frighteningly close to default. Not months away, not weeks away. In some moments, only hours away from running out of usable funds. That possibility sent shockwaves across both sides of the Atlantic, because Britain's collapse wouldn't stop in London. It would race through Wall Street. Banks would face enormous losses. Industrial contracts would collapse. Investors could panic. The financial system linking Britain and America had become so interconnected that failure on one side threatened the other. Wilson now held extraordinary leverage. He could continue restricting private finance, or he could replace it with something far more powerful: direct support from the United States government itself. When America entered the war in April 1917, that transition began. Private loans gradually gave way to government financing. On paper, Britain had gained a stronger ally. In reality, something much larger had happened. For more than a century, London had been the world's financial capital. Now that role was beginning its slow migration across the Atlantic. The center of global financial gravity was shifting toward New York. Britain would still help win the war, but it would never again dominate the world's financial system the way it once had. Yet, while Britain's leaders struggled to keep their economy alive, another group quietly recognized the empire's growing desperation. And they understood that moments of financial crisis often create opportunities that decades of normal diplomacy never could. Among them were leaders of the Zionist movement. Their timing would prove extraordinarily significant. The Balfour Declaration wasn't drafted when Britain was strong. It emerged when Britain was desperate. And to understand why, we first need to meet a man who had been investing in Palestine long before the First World War ever began. If Britain's financial crisis explains why the Balfour Declaration appeared in 1917, it doesn't explain why Palestine. To answer that question, we have to rewind more than 30 years. Long before the First World War, long before Arthur Balfour, and long before Britain's wartime desperation, another story had already begun. At the center of it stood one man, Baron Edmund James de Rothschild. Born into the famous French branch of the Rothschild banking family, Edmund inherited immense wealth. Unlike many financiers of his era, however, he devoted a significant portion of that fortune to a project that, at the time, seemed almost impossible. Beginning in the early 1880s, following violent pogroms against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire, Edmund began financing Jewish agricultural settlements in Ottoman Palestine. This wasn't simply philanthropy. It was a long-term investment in creating sustainable communities. He purchased land, paid off debts, financed irrigation systems, imported new farming techniques, built wineries, introduced crops such as grapefruit and avocado, supplied equipment, constructed roads and basic infrastructure. Settlements such as Rishon, Lezion, Zikron, Yaakov, and Rosh Pinna survived largely because Edmund continued paying their bills when few others could. Over the course of his lifetime, he donated more than £5 million to these settlements and acquired roughly 125,000 acres of land. At the time, the sum was extraordinary. In Palestine, many settlers simply referred to him as the Baron. Yet Edmund's vision wasn't identical to that of later political Zionists. He did not initially campaign for an independent Jewish state in the way Theodor Herzl eventually would. Instead, he believed deeply that Jewish communities could rebuild themselves through agriculture, self-sufficiency, and permanent settlement in their ancestral homeland. Regardless of motivation, the practical result was undeniable. Year after year, farms expanded. Communities grew. Institutions took shape. Infrastructure slowly emerged. By the time the First World War began, these settlements were no longer isolated experiments. They had become an established presence on the ground. This detail is often overlooked. When British officials debated the Balfour Declaration in 1917, they weren't discussing an entirely theoretical idea. They weren't being asked to support a vision that existed only on paper. They were looking at a network of communities that had already been financed, organized, and developed over several decades. In other words, the Declaration did not create the foundation. The foundation already existed. Britain was deciding whether to place the weight of the British Empire behind it. That distinction changes how the entire story is understood. Because once you recognize that the groundwork had already been laid, another question naturally follows. Why did British leaders choose 1917 at the darkest moment of the war to make that commitment? The answer lies not only in ideology, but in the desperate calculations of men trying to save an empire. And those calculations would soon bring together bankers, scientists, politicians, and one of the most consequential letters ever written. When Britain's Foreign Secretary finally decided to act, he did something almost unbelievable. Instead of drafting the famous declaration himself, he asked the very people who would receive it to help write it. That extraordinary decision reveals just how desperate Britain's position had become. By 1917, Britain's leaders weren't thinking only about winning battles. They were thinking about survival. Every decision coming out of London was shaped by the same brutal question. What will keep the empire alive for one more month? Money was running short. Russia was falling apart. American troops had entered the war, but they were still months away from making a meaningful difference on the battlefield. Germany, meanwhile, remained dangerous. If Russia collapsed completely, Germany could transfer hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers from the Eastern Front to France before the Allies were ready. Britain couldn't afford that outcome. It needed new advantages. Not just military ones, political advantages, financial advantages, diplomatic advantages, anything that might shift momentum before it was too late. This was the environment in which British officials reopened discussions with leaders of the Zionist movement. One meeting in particular would prove especially significant. On the 7th of February 1917, representatives of the British government, including Sir Mark Sykes, met with leading Zionist figures to discuss Britain's future policy toward Palestine. These weren't casual conversations. They took place while Britain's financial position was becoming increasingly desperate. Only a few months later, on June 19, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour made an unusual request. Rather than drafting Britain's declaration himself, he asked Lord Rothschild and Chaim Weizmann to prepare language expressing support for a Jewish national home. Pause for a moment and consider how extraordinary that was. Governments normally write their own declarations. Here, Britain's Foreign Secretary invited the future recipients of that declaration to help shape its wording. It reflected more than courtesy. It reflected urgency. British ministers wanted the statement to carry weight. They wanted it to resonate with Zionist leaders in Britain and abroad. According to historical records cited in the transcript, British policymakers also believed that publicly supporting Zionism could strengthen political and financial support among influential Jewish communities, particularly in Britain and the United States. This wasn't presented inside government discussions as a mysterious conspiracy. It was discussed as practical wartime strategy. Britain needed allies. Britain needed goodwill. Britain needed every possible source of support while fighting the most expensive war in its history. But finance wasn't the only calculation. The strategic map mattered just as much. Palestine occupied a position of enormous importance. To many British planners, control over the region meant helping secure the eastern approaches to the Suez Canal, one of the empire's most valuable strategic assets. The canal connected Britain with India, Australia, and much of Asia. Trade moved through it. Troops moved through it. Imperial communications depended on it. A friendly population near that corridor wasn't viewed as a luxury. It was viewed as an advantage Britain could scarcely afford to lose. Seen from London, the Balfour Declaration wasn't serving only one objective. It addressed several at once. It signaled support to the Zionist movement. It complemented Britain's wider wartime diplomacy. It aligned with broader strategic concerns surrounding the Eastern Mediterranean. And it emerged at precisely the moment Britain was searching for every possible advantage, financial, political, and military. Yet, there was another piece of this story that rarely appears in popular histories. One man whose influence reached the highest levels of the British government not because he commanded an army or owned a bank, but because he solved one of Britain's most urgent wartime problems. He was a scientist. His laboratory breakthrough helped keep British guns firing. And according to the historical record discussed in this transcript, that achievement significantly increased his influence in the conversations surrounding the Balfour Declaration. His name was Chaim Weizmann. Most people remember Chaim Weizmann as a Zionist leader and Israel's first president. Far fewer know that before he became either of those things, he helped solve a critical wartime supply crisis that Britain desperately needed to overcome. When most people hear the name Chaim Weizmann, they think of politics. They remember him as one of the leading figures of the Zionist movement. Many know he later became the first president of Israel. But in 1915, Britain knew him for something entirely different. Not as a politician, not as a diplomat, but as a scientist. And that distinction matters far more than it first appears. Because while Britain was struggling to finance the war, it was also struggling to supply it. Modern industrial warfare demanded unimaginable quantities of ammunition. Every artillery barrage consumed thousands of shells. Every naval engagement required enormous stores of explosives. Hidden inside that production process was a chemical that few people outside military circles had ever heard of. Acetone. On its own, acetone seemed insignificant. But without it, Britain couldn't manufacture cordite, the smokeless propellant used in virtually every artillery shell and rifle cartridge fired by British forces. No cordite. No ammunition. No ammunition. No army. Before the war, Britain had relied heavily on imports connected to Germany for part of its acetone production. Once war erupted, those supplies disappeared almost overnight. Alternative methods existed, but they were painfully inefficient. Producing acetone from wood required extraordinary quantities of timber. The process couldn't keep pace with the military's rapidly growing demand. Britain faced a genuine supply crisis. Then Weizmann offered a solution. Working at the University of Manchester, he developed a fermentation process using the bacterium Clostridium acetobutylicum, allowing acetone to be produced from starch on an industrial scale. To the scientific community, it was an impressive achievement. To the British government, it was something much more valuable. It was a strategic breakthrough. When Winston Churchill, serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, learned about Weizmann's work, he reportedly asked a simple question. We need 30,000 tons of acetone. Can you make it? Weizmann answered not with promises, but with results. He left academic life behind and dedicated himself to expanding production. Factories adopted the new process. Industrial output accelerated. By 1917, Britain was producing enough acetone to sustain the enormous wartime demand for cordite. According to the transcript, British forces fired approximately 248 million artillery shells during the First World War. A substantial portion of that production depended on a reliable supply of acetone made possible by Weizmann's process. Perhaps even more remarkable, Weizmann did not charge Britain for the rights to his discovery. He made the process available for the war effort. That decision transformed his standing inside the British government. He was no longer viewed simply as an advocate for Zionism. He had become someone who had made a tangible contribution to Britain's ability to continue fighting the war. Scientific achievement had opened doors that political lobbying alone might never have unlocked. Weizmann developed relationships with influential figures including Arthur Balfour, David Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill. His credibility no longer rested solely on persuasion. It rested on proven value during Britain's hour of greatest need. Later accounts even suggested that when David Lloyd George was asked what Britain had offered Weizmann in return for his contribution, he pointed toward the Balfour Declaration itself. Historians continue to debate exactly how much influence Weizmann's scientific work had on the final decision. But the historical record discussed in this transcript makes one point difficult to ignore. Science, politics, finance, and wartime necessity had become tightly intertwined. Yet, even after understanding Britain's financial desperation, the Rothschild connection, and Weizmann's extraordinary influence, the full picture still isn't complete. Because the Balfour Declaration wasn't Britain's first promise regarding Palestine. It wasn't even its second. Incredibly, it was the third. And all three promises pointed toward the same land, while promising very different futures to three different groups. Britain had promised Arab independence, it had secretly negotiated with France, then it promised support for a Jewish national home. Three agreements, one territory. Those contradictions would shape the Middle East for the next century. By late 1917, Britain had reached one of the most extraordinary moments in its diplomatic history. The Balfour Declaration is often remembered as a single promise. In reality, it was the third, and that's what makes the story so remarkable. Within roughly 2 years, Britain had made 3 separate commitments concerning the same region. Each served a different strategic purpose. Each was made to a different audience, and each became harder to reconcile with the others. The first promise emerged through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence between 1915 and 1916. Britain desperately wanted an Arab uprising against the Ottoman Empire. Such a revolt would force Ottoman forces to fight on multiple fronts, relieving pressure elsewhere in the war. In exchange, British officials discussed support for Arab independence after the conflict. The exact territorial boundaries remained deliberately vague. Palestine occupied an especially ambiguous position. That ambiguity would later become one of the most fiercely debated issues in modern diplomatic history. According to the historical record discussed in this transcript, Sharif Hussein understood Palestine to be included within the broader promise of Arab independence. Acting on that understanding, he launched the Arab Revolt alongside his sons Faisal and Abdullah, with support from T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. Thousands of Arab fighters entered the war believing they were helping secure their own political future. While those discussions continued, Britain was negotiating somewhere else as well. In 1916, Britain and France secretly concluded the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Instead of discussing independent Arab rule, this agreement divided much of the Ottoman Empire into future British and French spheres of influence. Palestine, under that arrangement, would fall under a form of international administration. The agreement remained secret because British leaders understood an uncomfortable reality. Its terms sat uneasily alongside the expectations created during the correspondence with Hussein. Then came the third promise, the Balfour Declaration. Issued in November 1917, it expressed British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also stating that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. On paper, each commitment addressed different political objectives. Together, however, they created a diplomatic puzzle with no simple solution. 3 different audiences, 3 different expectations, 1 territory. The transcript also highlights another striking detail. Although the Arab population represented more than 90% of Palestine's inhabitants at the time, the Balfour Declaration referred to them only as the existing non-Jewish communities. Their national identity was not explicitly acknowledged within the document itself. Whether viewed as strategic diplomacy, wartime expediency, or political contradiction, the result was the same. Each group believed Britain had made an important commitment. Each expected those commitments to be honored, yet fulfilling all 3 simultaneously was impossible. Britain had postponed a conflict. It had not resolved one. For a government fighting for survival in the middle of the First World War, immediate victory mattered more than long-term consistency. The future could wait. Winning the war could not. But history has a way of presenting the bill for decisions made under pressure. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, Britain discovered that victory carried a price far greater than anyone had anticipated. It had won the war, yet financially. It had lost the position that had made it the world's greatest empire. When the war ended, Britain was no longer the world's banker. It had become one of the world's largest debtors, responsible for governing territories it could barely afford, while trying to manage promises it could no longer reconcile. The final chapter of the story was only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Britain stood on the winning side of history. Germany had surrendered. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed. The Allies had prevailed. From a military perspective, Britain had achieved what it set out to do. But victory can hide another story. And financially, Britain looked nothing like the country that had entered the war 4 years earlier. Before 1914, it had been the world's greatest creditor. Now, it was one of the world's largest debtors. Its national debt had climbed beyond £7 billion. Much of the overseas investment portfolio that had made London the financial capital of the world had been sold to finance the war. Even worse, many of the loans Britain had extended to its allies were never fully recovered. Russia had fallen into revolution. The new Bolshevik government rejected the debts of the previous regime. Money Britain expected to recover simply disappeared. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States expected repayment of its wartime loans. America had not replaced Britain merely as a military partner. It had replaced Britain as the world's financial center. The balance of economic power had shifted permanently. The pound sterling no longer stood alone at the center of global finance. The dollar was beginning its ascent. But Britain's problems didn't end with debt. Victory had brought new responsibilities. Through the League of Nations mandate, Britain assumed responsibility for governing Palestine, charged with implementing the principles outlined in the Balfour Declaration while also safeguarding the rights of the territory's existing population. On paper, the mandate appeared manageable. In practice, it proved extraordinarily difficult. Jewish immigration increased throughout the 1920s. The rise of Nazism in the 1930s accelerated that movement dramatically. After the Holocaust, even larger numbers sought refuge in Palestine. At the same time, many Arabs viewed these demographic changes with growing alarm. Tensions escalated. Demonstrations became larger. Political disputes hardened. Eventually, violence followed. The Great Arab Revolt of 1936 1939, became one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings Britain faced during the interwar years. According to the transcript, Britain responded by deploying large military forces and adopting extensive security measures in an effort to restore control. Instead of creating stability, the mandate became increasingly expensive, increasingly dangerous, increasingly difficult to govern. Then, history repeated itself. The Second World War erupted. By the time it ended, Britain was financially exhausted once again. Its national debt had reached approximately 249% of GDP. The empire that had once governed nearly a quarter of the world no longer possessed the economic strength to sustain its global commitment. India moved toward independence. Colonial authority weakened across Africa and Asia, and Palestine became one of the empire's most difficult burdens. Violence now came from multiple directions. Arab resistance continued. At the same time, Jewish underground organizations, including Irgun and Lehi, launched attacks against British personnel and infrastructure. The government that had once promised to protect competing interests found itself trusted by almost no one. Maintaining order required money Britain no longer had, political capital it no longer possessed, and military resources it could scarcely spare. By 1947, British leaders accepted a painful reality. The problem they had inherited and helped shape could no longer be solved by Britain alone. The Palestine question was referred to the newly formed United Nations. The following year, in May 1948, the State of Israel declared independence. One of the central figures behind the Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann, became its first president. For Britain, however, the ending carried a profound irony. The Balfour Declaration had been intended, in part, to strengthen Britain's strategic position during its darkest hour. Instead, over the following decades, Palestine became one of the most costly and politically divisive responsibilities the empire would ever assume. Britain had won the war, but, in many respects, it had lost the financial supremacy that made its empire possible. And the promise issued in 1917 continued generating consequences long after the men who signed it were gone. So, was the Balfour Declaration really a financial transaction disguised as diplomacy? Or is that explanation too simple for one of history's most complicated decisions? To answer that, we have to separate documented history from speculation, and that's where the final lesson begins. One of the biggest lessons from this story is that wars are rarely won by armies alone. They are sustained by money. They are shaped by credit. And sometimes the decisions that leave the deepest mark on history are made not on the battlefield, but in government offices, bank boardrooms, and quiet diplomatic meetings far from the front lines. The Balfour Declaration wasn't just a wartime document. It became part of a chain of events whose consequences continue to influence international politics more than a century later. Whether you see it primarily as an act of wartime strategy, imperial diplomacy, political calculation, or a combination of many different forces, one thing is difficult to deny. Understanding the financial pressures behind major historical decisions often reveals a side of history that traditional narratives leave unexplored. So we'd like to hear your perspective. Which factor do you think mattered most in Britain's decision in 1917? Financial desperation, military strategy, diplomacy, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden connections between finance, history, and global power, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more documentaries exploring the overlooked forces that shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.